"Move aside, you worthless piece of trash." A hard shove, no hesitation. An elderly homeless man crashes onto the cold concrete, right in the middle of the crowd, and dozens of cameramen are starving for blood. Above him, a K-9 growls, taut like a drawn wire. In front of him, Marcus Kane stands behind the command barrier, his voice clipped and cold like pulling a trigger. Attack, and if the dog lunges, that old man will be erased from this story on the spot. But only seconds later, just a single moment, the dog does not charge. It freezes. It turns its head. It looks straight at the old man. "Stay." One word slips out. Horse, belonging to no training manual. The K-9 stands perfectly still. Cameras zoom in tight. Gun barrels sweep across the crowd. Kane freezes for exactly one beat, long enough for a crack to show. That old man is not someone who wandered in by accident. He is John Harlan, a former soldier once disciplined for stopping a mission when he saw a child standing directly in front of a dog. And Kane is the one who signed the decision to remove that break from the playbook so that from then on, no one would ever be allowed to stop again. If you were John, would you give the order to save the system, or stay silent to avoid killing the wrong person? And if you were standing in that crowd that day, would you want the police to act fast, or have the nerve to stop when they were not sure? If this passage makes you uncomfortable, angry, or forces you to pause for a moment and think, leave your perspective in the comments below, and hit subscribe, because the stories that follow will not comfort you, they will force you to choose. The city slipped into rush hour with a familiar rhythm, people pouring into the streets like a broken levee, shoes striking concrete, tires screeching to a stop, metal doors slamming shut. The alley south of the station was narrower than usual, not because it was crowded but because everyone tried to press to one side, keeping a pocket of air for themselves. Backs in worn coats crowded under the awnings, waiting for a late meal from the charity kitchen, waiting for a light that still worked so the night could have a shape. No one thought tonight would be different. The smell of damp trash, cold coffee from the roadside stall, and old rain trapped in the bricks blended into a familiar base layer that the people who lived here had learned to ignore. A siren tore through the air, drilling straight into the ears. A tactical vehicle charged in, braked hard, doors flying open. Red and blue lights swept across, faces gone pale with surprise. A police officer shouted, his voice hoarse from wind and habit, "Back up, one more step and you're in cuffs." The crowd reacted on instinct, retreating toward the wall, crushing together as if afraid of being swallowed. Some cursed to cover their fear, some dropped their heads to avoid eye contact, and some froze because they had not yet understood what was happening. An old man stumbled from the pressure. Someone caught him and let go immediately when they saw an officer turn their way. John Harlan had been there before the siren sounded. He sat close to a power pole, back against damp brick, both hands resting on his knees out of old habit. 60 years old, patchy gray beard, and a jacket heavier than the weather required. He chose this alley for the steady light, for the last meal of the day, because people here were less likely to kick him awake in the night. When the tactical team surged in, John tried to stand on reflex, but the press of bodies behind him moved faster. A man behind shoved him hard, snapping, "Move, you useless piece of trash." John fell, his knee hitting the cold concrete. He did not cry out. He braced himself, rose slowly, brushed dust from his pant leg, as if used to no one waiting for him. At the mouth of the alley, the suspect was pinned against a wet brick. His jacket was pulled high, the collar hiding half his face. One hand stayed in his pocket, eyes darting, breath short. Tom held the front line, body armor tight at his neck, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. He muttered, just loud enough for the man beside him to hear, "He's carrying something, for sure." The other officer did not answer, only adjusted his stance, muzzle lowering, then lifting with each breath. The formation closed in, orders passed in clipped phrases over the radio, words worn smooth by hundreds of drills. Tom pulled the lead, brought Rex forward. The large K-9 was all muscle and tension, claws scraping lightly on the pavement with a dry sound. Rex flicked a glance over the crowd, ears straight up, then locked onto the suspect. Tom's voice came down like a hammer. "Attack." The command left his mouth faster than thought, a reflex trained past the point of choice. At this distance, he trusted the manual more than instinct. Rex did not charge. A gap opened between heartbeats, wide enough for everything to slip off course. The dog planted himself in front of the suspect, body low, a soft growl vibrating in his chest. more warning than threat. An officer on the right flank slipped in surprise, his muzzle sweeping across the crowd for a dangerous instant. Someone screamed, "Don't shoot!" A woman hugged her child tight to the wall, and a man raised both hands, even though no one had asked. Sweat ran down Tom's spine as his grip tightened on the lead. John heard the metal slide into the battery, a familiar sound striking straight into memories that had never fully slept. His whole body tensed as if pulled by an invisible line. He took half a step forward, instinct pushing him out of his fragile pocket of safety. Then he stopped, his eyes locked on Rex. No panic there, only a sharp focus he thought he had lost. In that moment, other alleys layered over the present. Other nights, other missions lived on the thin line between right and no return. John recognized Rex's posture. The weight shifted back, the eyes fixed on the target, yet not leaving him. This was not stubbornness, it was waiting. The crowd behind John began to stir, some whispering prayers, some cursing the police, some just wanting to get out as fast as possible. Time shrank into a thin thread, one small pull away from snapping. He let out a rough word, unrounded, more survival reflex than calculation. Stay. The sound fell onto the damp concrete. Not loud, but clear enough. Rex froze completely. Not a muscle moved. The lead slackened slightly in Tom's hand. The entire alley held its breath. Even the distant sirens seemed turned down, leaving a heavy, uncomfortable silence. Tom spun around, eyes red with adrenaline and anger. He yanked John's arm. "Who gave you the right to give orders? Are you trying to get yourself killed?" The cuffs snapped open, cold metal closing on John's wrists. He did not resist. He only looked at Rex once more, long enough for the dog to understand, short enough that no one could stop it. The cold metal made John shiver, not from pain but from how fast the familiar feeling returned. The crowd reacted a beat later, then noise shattered out, protests mixed with shouting, someone calling to let him go, someone else yelling that he had just ruined the operation. Another officer stepped in, a hand on Tom's shoulder as a reminder to keep space. Rex still did not move, ears slightly lowered, eyes tracking every movement of John as if afraid to miss a signal. John let his arms be pulled behind him, his shoulder joint flaring with pain, but he made no sound. In his head, old commands ran through and dissolved, giving way to a rare pocket of clear awareness. He knew this moment would be understood, in every way except the way he had lived it. He knew from this second on, the story would no longer belong to the alley. John was shoved into the vehicle amid the slam of the door and the smell of hot rubber. The light inside the compartment flicked on, white glare washing straight over his face, exposing every wrinkle and the layer of dust he had not yet washed off. The cuffs tightened behind his back, sending a dull ache through his shoulders. But what bothered him more was the silence stretched out on purpose. Two officers sat opposite him without speaking, looking at him the way one looks at an unidentified object, something that had just fallen out of a safe orbit. The vehicle rolled forward, turned sharply, and then stopped. The station came into view with its cold lights and overlapping radio chatter, like a body checking its own wounds. The interrogation room was narrow, the metal table scratched, the chair bolted to the floor. John was pushed down into it. An investigator stepped in, did not give his name, and tossed a bottle of water onto the table with a sharp flick of the wrist. Plastic hit metal with a dry clack. He leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, voice low but harsh. "Who are you? Who do you work for? Talk?" The questions were spoken like a procedure, rather than an expectation. John looked at the bottle, then up, his gaze so flat, it irritated the man across from him. He said exactly one sentence, his voice dry as sand. "I used to work with K9, not one word more." Then he went silent. That silence was not defiance, and not fear, but like a door that had been closed for a long time. Outside, the K9 training yard was lit up. Rex was let out, the leash changing hands. The new handler was younger than Tom, his voice trying to stay calm. He gave the order, "Down." Rex did not move, ears upright, eyes fixed on an invisible point ahead. There was no familiar response, only a low growl rising from his chest, enough to tense everyone nearby. The handler gave a light tug on the leash, the way he had been taught as a reminder. Rex sprang half a beat, not an attack, just enough to make the whole team flinch backward. One officer swore under his breath. Another raised a hand to signal distance. No one laughed. No one offered reassurance. Tom stood at the edge of the yard, his sweat not yet dry. He snapped, "He's broken. Pull him off the streets." His superior, a gray-haired man, watched the scene and replied evenly, "There's no replacement right now. There's a mission tomorrow." The sentence landed like a decision already calculated, leaving no room for argument. Tom turned away, jaw clenched, fist tightening and loosening, as if trying to swallow something bitter. In the interrogation room, the investigator's phone kept vibrating. The screen lit up, then went dark, lit up, then went dark again. When he glanced down, John caught the reflection on the glass. Lines of text scrolling fast. Homeless man controls K9. Security breach. Another headline appeared right after. Shorter, sharper. The investigator shut off the screen and placed the phone face down on the table, as if covering a stain. He changed his tone, less harsh but heavier. Do you know what people out there are saying right now? John did not answer. He looked into the space between them, where every explanation became unnecessary. In the hallway, a seasoned officer leaned against the wall, replaying the clip on his phone. He looked up at Tom as Tom passed, his voice slow. You shouted attack like a machine. Today someone almost died. Tom stopped and spun around. I followed the manual. The reply came out fast, familiar, like a mantra. The older officer did not argue, only shook his head very slightly, as if he had heard that line too many times in his life. In the small meeting room next to the yard, the superior opened the digital file, scrolled, and initialed it with a stylus. His voice did not change as he read, marked unstable, pending removal. He paused for a beat, then added, but still deployed under control. No one asked what control meant. No one wanted to be the one to ask. The room stayed quiet, filled only with the hum of the air conditioner and someone breathing harder than usual. John was left sitting alone a while longer. The bottle of water still lay on the table, unopened. He caught fragments of conversation slipping through the door crack, scattered words like danger, pressure, media, and responsibility. He closed his eyes for a few seconds, not to escape, but to keep his mind from being pulled back into the past. When he opened them, he saw the scratch marks on the table, shaped like a broken road. He thought of Rex, of the way the dog had stopped in the middle of chaos, and the sense of waiting in those eyes. He knew that waiting was being misread everywhere. Outside, the new handler tried again, changing his approach, voice softer. Rex, listen to me. Rex turned his head, not toward the voice giving the command, but toward the door leading into the administrative wing. The low growl sounded again, not violent, but enough to remind everyone that this dog was holding his own boundary. Another officer muttered, half jokingly, half seriously, he's picked his owner. No one laughed. Tom turned back, his gaze darkening, as if he had just heard something forbidden. The investigator returned to the interrogation room and pulled out a chair across from John. He exhaled, voice lowered. Do you understand how far this could go? John met his eyes without flinching. I understand it won't stop at the alley. The answer made the investigator frown. He opened his mouth as if to say more, then stopped at the sound of a knock. The interrogation room door swung open. A female staffer stood in the doorway holding a thin file and said simply, Sarah Harlan is on her way. John froze for exactly one beat. The name struck him faster and deeper than any question before it. He swallowed hard, his throat dry and burning, then returned to his familiar calm. The investigator looked at him and, for the first time, saw a small crack in that composure. No one spoke. The space between them tightened, as if another door had just opened, leading to a kind of confrontation no manual had prepared for. Sarah Harlan walked into the station with the familiar gait of someone who had spent too long in controlled corridors. She wore a dark jacket, hair tied back neatly, her staff badge still hanging on her chest, not yet removed. The fluorescent lights washed her skin a little pale, but her eyes stayed sharp and alert, the eyes of someone here to handle consequences, not to embrace the past. When the interrogation room door opened, she stopped for a beat. The handcuffs came into view first, cold metal on the wrists of the man she called Dad. Sarah looked at the cuffs, then straight at John's face. What did you do again, Dad? John did not look up right away. He stared at the edge of the table, where the light formed a thin line of reflection. His voice was steady and low. I didn't do anything. Sarah let out a short laugh, without any warmth. You never do anything. The words fell between them like an old habit repeated, enough for both to understand this was not the first time they stood on opposite sides of a room like this. The investigator beside them stepped back half a pace, sensing a private atmosphere taking shape. Sarah pulled out a chair and sat across from him. She did not ask more right away. She studied John's face, the new wrinkles she had never seen before, the small abrasion on his wrist where the cuffs had rubbed. She thought she was used to seeing him at the bottom of society, used to the brief calls from different stations. But this time was different. This time, his name was running across screens all over the city. She took a deep breath, kept her voice steady. Do you know where this is heading? John answered slowly. I know it won't stop at the alley. Sarah stood up and motioned to the investigator. Take me to the K9 area. Without waiting for an answer, she turned and walked ahead. Outside, Rex was being held at a safe distance, the leash pulled tight. The handler facing him tried to stay calm, but his posture gave away the tension. Rex braced himself, muscles standing out under his coat, breathing heavy. When Sarah approached the fence, Rex growled, the sound hitting her chest like a warning. She stopped on reflex. At that moment, John was brought out behind her, standing a few steps from the fence. Rex lowered his shoulders almost immediately, the growl cutting off, his body loosening, though he stayed alert. Sarah froze. What she saw was too clear to be explained as a coincidence. She spun toward Tom, who stood at the edge of the yard. I want the full file on this incident, and his military records. Tom frowned, his voice hardening. You don't have the authority. Sarah met his eyes, not raising her voice, but each word landing firm. I do. The air sagged. Tom glanced at his superior, then turned away without another word. Sarah did not follow. She was used to others having to decide for themselves where they stood. John remained still behind the fence, his voice quieter, as if afraid of being overheard. Don't pull yourself into this. Sarah turned back, her gaze not softening. You already did. The reply was quick and clean, leaving no space for pity. In that moment, John realized his daughter had not come to defend him. She had come to check whether the man in front of her was still the threat the system had once labeled him. Tom stood nearby and let out a line meant for Sarah to hear. He's homeless. Who would believe him? Sarah turned her head, her eyes going cold. I don't believe. I verify. She did not raise her voice, but the sentence was sharp enough to cut off the murmurs. Tom fell silent, lips pressed tight, his hand gripping the leash as if searching for something to hold on to. Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled quickly. The alley clip was already on the front page, filmed from every angle, paired with every kind of headline. Comments poured in like a flood, toxic and fast. One line stood out. Trash. Ruined. The operation. Her fingers tightened around the phone until they went white. She shut off the screen and slid it into her jacket, as if stuffing away something filthy that had just stuck to her hand. She looked up at John, and for the first time, a hint of wavering showed, not pity but fear at the scale of the wave forming. They returned to the interrogation room. Files were brought in and placed on the table in front of Sarah. She flipped through page by page, her eyes moving fast, fluent in the cold language of reports. John sat across from her in silence. He recognized the way she read, missing nothing, trusting nothing right away. It was how she had learned to survive in the system he had fallen out of. She stopped at one line and looked up. How long have you been around Rex? John answered. Long enough for him to remember. Sarah did not ask more. She knew there were answers logic could not dig into. Outside, Rex growled again when another handler stepped too close. The sound carried through the glass, a reminder that time was not standing still. Sarah closed the file and exhaled. You understand if you're right. This will make the whole system look wrong. John nodded very slightly. And you understand if you're wrong. The whole city pays. John did not look away. He met his daughter's eyes. I've lived with that sentence for a long time. Sarah stood and paced a few steps in the room, as if needing space to think. She stopped in front of John and bent just enough for their eyes to meet. Her voice dropped, slow and deliberate. If you're tied to anything dirty, I'll be the one who signs for you to disappear. The words came without trembling, without anger, like a fact that had to be placed on the table. John looked at her and stayed silent. He did not argue or defend himself. In his eyes was something Sarah had never clearly seen before, not pleading and not defiance, but the bare acceptance of someone long used to being placed where he had to carry the consequences of other people's choices. Sarah stayed behind in the small meeting room behind the interrogation area, the kind of place used to read things no one wanted spilling into the hallway. The ceiling lights were even, shadowless, the kind of light meant for the theater. The military file lay in front of her, thick cover, worn edges, the smell of old paper mixed with the metallic scent of a binder clip. John sat across from her, hands resting on his thighs, back straight by instinct, as if this chair were still the one in a briefing room years ago. Tom leaned against the wall, arms folded, his gaze wavering between vigilance and irritation. Sarah turned the pages slowly. She was not reading for emotion, she was reading for structure. Each page was a marker, a notation, a cut. When she stopped, her voice came out dry and level, refused to execute order. She looked up immediately, not letting the words settle. Who do you think you are? The question was not accusatory. It was measuring, like placing an object on a scale. John did not avoid it. He met his daughter's eyes, his voice low and solid. I thought I was someone who doesn't pull the trigger for someone else. No rhetoric, no justification, just a sentence worn down by years of asking and answering himself. Tom shifted his weight, as if the words had touched a nerve he did not want to acknowledge. Sarah took a deep breath, flipped a few more pages, then dropped the entire file onto the table. Paper hit metal with a dry crack. Because you hesitated, people died. The sentence came out faster than she intended. John nodded very slightly. Yes. One short word, enough to stop her. She waited for something else, a defense, a shield, but there was none. That bare admission made the room heavier. John did not wait to be asked more. He continued, short and direct, the way someone recounts an event already framed in their mind. There was a child, right in front of the dog's nose. He did not elaborate, did not need to say age, did not need to describe eyes. Sarah snapped back almost immediately, her voice sharp. There are no ifs on the battlefield. She had heard that line often enough in training sessions, in reports stamped and approved. John looked at her. His gaze neither softened nor hardened. But there is wrong. The words dropped into the room like a heavy object, not loud, but impossible to ignore. Tom exhaled hard and turned away, as if he did not want to be dragged into an argument beyond his remit. Sarah was silent for a few seconds, then asked, "What did they do after that?" Her voice was no longer sharp, but cold. John answered, "They removed the brake, so no one would dare stop again." He spoke as if reading back an administrative decision, but Sarah heard the cost beneath it. She understood what a brake meant in a system built to move forward. Once removed, every motion had to end in impact. She leaned down to the last page. Her finger stopped on a signature. The name stood out clearly, the ink darker than the rest, as if written with decisive force. Marcus Kane. Sarah read it aloud, then looked at Tom. Tom swore under his breath, surprise and irritation bleeding through. Kane is a city advisor now. The room seemed to take on another layer of invisible pressure. That name was not in the past. It was in the present, very close. Sarah leaned back in her chair and looked straight at John. "Do you know who he is now?" John nodded. "I've heard." He did not ask more, did not need to. Titles did not change the nature of a decision already signed. Tom cut in, his voice low but urgent. "This isn't an old story anymore." Sarah turned to him. "I know." She looked back at the file, slower this time. The cold lines now carried clearer consequences. Sarah asked, "Did you think about being removed back then?" John replied, "I thought about having to look at myself in the mirror the next morning." The answer made Sarah clench her hand. She realized the distance between them was not the event, but the standard for continuing to live. Tom paced a few steps in the room, unable to stay still. "If this comes out, they'll ask why your father was allowed to stop." Sarah answered immediately. "He didn't stop because of authority. He stopped because of responsibility." Tom shook his head. "They don't distinguish between those things." Sarah looked at him. "I do." The air tightened. Outside, Rex's low growl carried through the thick glass, a reminder that this story was not staying inside the file. Sarah turned to John, her voice lower. "Do you understand that if this gets exposed, they'll use that death to crush you all over again?" John answered, "I understand." He paused, then added, "But I also understand that pretending it never happened means someone else will die the same way." Sarah stood and walked to the small window overlooking the yard. She saw Rex standing still, ears up, eyes fixed on the administrative wing. The sight brought back the moment at the fence, when the dog lowered his shoulders simply because John stood nearby. She turned back, her voice quieter. "What does stay mean to you?" John answered without hesitation. "It's the moment I realized I still had a choice." Sarah closed her eyes for a second, letting the answer pass through. Tom stopped beside the table and looked again at Kane's signature. "If Kane knows he's being dragged back into this," he did not finish. Sarah said, "He won't see this as a moral story." John looked at Tom. "I don't expect him to." He looked to Sarah. "I just want you to know what you're signing." Sarah returned to her chair, flipped back to the first page, then closed the file. She placed her hand on it, as if sealing a door for the moment. "I need more time," Tom blurted. "We don't have much." Sarah looked at him. "Then pray the truth is on your side." Tom said nothing. At that moment, the desk phone rang, sharp and urgent. Tom startled and stepped forward to pick it up. He looked at the display, his face draining of color. He turned back, his voice suddenly hoarse. "Kane is calling." Marcus Kane arrived at the station in mid-afternoon, when the work rhythm had just settled after a tense night. He did not bring a noisy entourage, only an aide standing half a step behind, and a stride confident enough to need no one clearing the way. Dark suit, neat tie, everything on him was just enough. Nothing extra, nothing showy. When Kane entered the meeting room, the superior stood first and shook his hand firmly. Kane smiled politely, the grip calibrated precisely to assert position. His eyes swept over John sitting in the corner, paused for a fraction of a second. "I remember you." The voice was even, neither high nor low, as if recalling a detail from an old file. John did not respond. He stayed silent, his gaze not avoiding but not clinging either. Kane turned to Sarah and gave a slight nod, a greeting to an equal collaborator. He did not mention the father-daughter relationship. There was no need. For Kane, all relationships came after function. He sat down, placed a thin folder in front of him, and spoke as if lecturing a class, long accustomed to hard truths. Hesitation kills more people than mistakes. The line slid out smoothly, used often enough to need no emphasis. Sarah leaned forward and cut in immediately. "Are you sure?" Kane looked at her, the corner of his mouth lifting almost imperceptibly. "I'm sure about statistics." He turned his head toward the glass wall, overlooking the K9 yard, where Rex stood in a controlled zone. Kane gestured lightly. "A K9 that does not obey is a broken weapon." Tom, standing nearby, swallowed hard. He did not object and did not nod, only felt the sentence drag behind it, a chain of consequences he did not want to follow. Kane continued, "Broken weapons must be removed. That is procedure." The way he said it made the procedure sound like a moral shield. Out in the hallway, reporters had already gathered, cameras raised, microphones thrust forward, questions ricocheting through the tight space. "Is it true that a homeless man infiltrated the force?" Another voice cut in. "Who is responsible for the wrong order?" The superior signaled. John was pulled to his feet, the cuffs already removed, but two officers tight at his sides, escorting him down the hall like a system error being brought into the light. Kane walked slowly behind, far enough not to be directly tied to the scene, close enough to ensure everything moved in the right direction. Cameras flashed nonstop. John stepped in front of the lenses, his face stripped bare by the lights. Kane stood at the edge of the frame, his tone calm as he addressed the press. "We are handling a procedural incident. No mention of John, no mention of Rex. Only an incident, only procedure." A reporter tried to force a question about ethics. Kane smiled faintly. "Ethics exist within the framework of discipline." The answer was round enough to make the evening news. When the crowd was pushed back, Kane turned to Sarah. He lowered his voice, just enough for the two of them. "Do you want to be right, or do you want a chair to keep working from?" There was no direct threat, only a cold comparison. Sarah met his eyes without flinching. "Are you more afraid of stay than of a wrong attack?" Kane's expression did not change. "I'm afraid of precedent." He said it as if that were a more tangible danger than any individual life. In the more secure meeting room, the superior laid out the plan for the next day. A large-scale operation, many people, many cameras, heavy political pressure. He spoke firmly. "Tomorrow there's a major operation. Rex still goes out." Sarah rose half a beat. "He's pending removal." Kane folded his arms and leaned back. "Pending removal does not mean stopping use. Not until there's a replacement." The sentence came out clean, like an equation. Tom looked at Rex through the glass, then at Kane. "If he freezes again," he left it unfinished. Kane cut in. "Then that is evidence." Tom understood, his throat going dry. Sarah understood too. Evidence was not to correct an error, but to seal it shut. John stood still in the corner, like a detail already processed. Kane turned to him, polite. "You'll be released. There's no basis to hold you." John looked at him. "Why let me go?" Kane answered at once. "So the public sees we are transparent." He tilted his head. "And so they see where the risk lies." John said nothing more. He understood he had just been placed in a new role, a symbol rather than a person. Sarah followed Kane into the hallway. Footsteps echoed evenly on the tile. She said, "You're using my father to cover an old decision." Kane stopped and turned. "I'm preventing a debate the public is not equipped to handle." Sarah gave a thin smile. "Or you're protecting your signature?" Kane looked at her a beat longer. "A signature is only a consequence, Miss Harlan. What I protect is order." At the end of the hall, Kane stopped at the exit. He looked straight at Sarah, the cold smile clearer now. "If there's blood tomorrow, they'll need someone to blame." He opened the door and stepped into the daylight, leaving behind a sentence hanging in the air, heavy as a forecast. The square was sealed off early, while the sunlight had not yet fully risen above the low rooftops. Metal barricades were set up in layers, loudspeakers rasping in a steady voice. "Disperse. Disperse immediately." The sound slammed into the air like a tired command repeated too many times. The crowd did not disperse. They were only pressed closer together, one person's back against another's chest. eyes fixed on what was happening at the front line. Television cameras were planted tight against the barricades, long lenses aimed straight at the K9 zone, as if waiting for an explosion that had been promised in advance. Rex stood in his familiar position, the leash pulled just tight enough. His body was steady, ears up, eyes sweeping for the smallest movements ahead. Tom stood beside him, his hands slick with sweat despite the cold morning wind. He flicked a glance toward Kane, who stood behind the command barrier, posture straight, face unreadable. Kane gave a very slight nod, like a signal agreed on beforehand. Everything was arranged to look like a perfect drill. John stood behind a secondary barrier, a position chosen carefully, close enough for Rex to see him, far enough that no one could say he was directly intervening. He kept his hands close to his body, shoulders tense, eyes locked on the front line. He felt his heartbeat clearly in his ears, steady but heavy, as if each beat had to pass through a thick layer of memory. He knew today was not a normal operation. This was a test, and he was part of it even though no one had said his name. In the mobile command center, Sarah stood in front of the large screen. Feeds from multiple angles were split into panels, Rex filling the main frame. She saw every small detail, the way Tom tightened the leash, the way Rex shifted his weight. Sarah's hands were icy cold even though she stood in a room full of people. She heard Kane's voice through the headset, short and precise, like reading from a familiar script. A movement out of rhythm appeared at the edge of the crowd. A man pushed against the flow, his shoulders bumping others, his hand repeatedly digging into his jacket. Tom saw it first. He tilted his head and murmured just loud enough for the radio to catch. "He's moving against the flow. Keeps reaching into his jacket." John heard the words carry across the space, his face tightening. He clearly saw the hurried gait, the unfocused eyes, the kind of danger experience had taught him to respect. Kane signaled with a short hand motion, his voice coming through the radio. "Attack." Tom repeated it almost immediately, his voice a notch higher with tension. "Rex, attack." The command snapped out cleanly, without hesitation, exactly as Kane wanted. The camera zoomed in tighter, capturing the moment before everything broke. Rex stopped, not a vague hesitation, but a full stop. His body locked, claws gripping the pavement. He turned his head, eyes searching for John through the barricades and the mass of bodies. The entire front line froze for exactly one beat, as if someone had pulled the power from the system. An officer behind raised his weapon, and then halted midway. The crowd ahead stirred, shouts rising into a thin wave. In the command center, Sarah lifted a hand to her mouth on instinct. Her voice burst over the radio, low and shaking. "Dad, do something." She knew she had just crossed a professional line, but she could not stop herself. On the screen, Rex remained still, waiting. John clenched his jaw. He felt his tongue press against dry teeth. His mouth opened slightly, enough for a word to escape, then closed. He stayed silent. That moment stretched longer than anything the cameras could capture. Not because time truly slowed, but because in everyone's mind it swelled into a question without an answer. There was no new command. The formation was forced to adjust on its own. Tom swallowed hard and signaled by hand, the front line widening its arc. Shields came up, tasers ready. They closed in manually amid the crowd's hissing curses as people were pushed back yet again. The man moving against the flow panicked when he saw the circle tighten, turned and ran a few steps, then was slammed to the ground. Metal struck pavement, heavy breathing, someone shouting to keep a distance. John saw everything from behind the barrier, clear down to each movement. He saw Rex still standing, not pulling, not lunging, as if he understood the task had shifted into another form. He also saw how fragile this solution was, how risk spread across every square meter of ground. He knew some in the unit were silently cursing his silence. The suspect was pinned, his arms twisted behind his back. A knife fell from his jacket and skittered across the ground. A crude homemade device was pulled out, wires hastily wrapped, battery exposed. An officer slipped while closing in, his arm slamming hard into the metal barricade. Blood seeped through his glove, dark red and unmistakable under the lights and lenses. No one died, but that blood was enough to tell a different story. Kane observed from a distance, his expression unchanged. He turned to his aide and spoke quietly. "Log it." The aide nodded. In the command center, Sarah stared at the blood on the screen, her chest tightening. She knew this moment would be cut, spliced, and headlined in a way that would no longer leave the truth intact. Breaking news hit almost immediately. A ticker ran across a secondary screen in the command center. "Homeless man obstructs order. Police bloodshed." Sarah looked at the words, then back at the image of Rex standing still, John frozen behind the barrier. For the first time, a quiet thought slipped into her mind, sharp and uncomfortable. Maybe Dad really is the problem. The evening after the operation, the city was no longer talking about the suspect who had been restrained, or the knife and the improvised device. The story was retold along a different axis, cleaner, easier to swallow. Phone screens lit up non-stop inside the station, headline after headline, capital letters, heavy exclamation marks. Elderly homeless man sabotages operation. Another line scrolled faster. Who is responsible when police bleed? Beneath them were thousands of comments piling up, words tossed out as lightly as gravel. Throw him in jail. Social trash. Homeless and thinks he can teach cops. Get rid of that dog before it kills someone. Tom sat in the break room, his phone vibrating constantly in his hand. He scrolled through a few lines, jaw tightening. His hand trembled slightly. Then he slammed the phone down onto the metal table. The impact rang out dry and sharp. They're calling me useless because the dog didn't obey. His voice was higher than usual, not quite angry, but a kind of humiliation that was hard to name. A young officer sitting across from him stared down into a cup of cold coffee, unsure what to say. No one in the room laughed. There was no room for laughter in this story anymore. In another corner of the station, an older officer was changing the bandage on a colleague injured during the operation. Fresh gauze covered the gash on the arm. The bleeding had stopped, but the skin was still swollen. He looked at the bandage, then at the younger officer, his voice slow. Today's blood is a warning. Tomorrow it could be a life. The sentence was not aimed at anyone in particular, but it was enough to silence everyone nearby. A few eyes looked away. A few heads nodded very slightly, as if they had thought the same thing but had not dared to say it. An emergency meeting followed immediately. The room was cramped, chairs pulled close. The smell of sweat and coffee mixed. The superior stood at the head of the table, palms pressed to the wood, voice rough. We don't need philosophy, we need control. The sentence was delivered like a final proposition. A few people nodded at once, as if finding something solid to hold on to. A few others stayed silent, their eyes uncertain. Sarah sat off to one side, back straight, both hands on the table. When she heard that, she looked up directly, not waiting to be called on. Control by pulling the trigger sooner? The question dropped into the room. No one answered. The superior looked at her for a few seconds, then turned to someone else, as if the question had never been spoken. That silence was heavier than any rebuttal. Sarah understood she had just placed another large mark on her own forehead. At the same time, John was being escorted down the hallway to sign a few more procedural forms. He walked slowly, not from fatigue, but because he noticed the looks around him had changed. People who used to pass him the way they passed an old wall now looked longer, their eyes mixed with wariness and contempt. An administrative staffer muttered as he passed, quietly enough to deny it if questioned. Some kind of veteran. John heard it. He did not stop. He had heard similar words in many places before, in many different forms, but this time, they echoed inside the very place that once hung slogans about honor. Sarah caught up with him at the end of the hallway. She signaled the escorting officer to stop. Let me talk to him. The officer hesitated for a beat, then nodded and stepped back. Sarah turned to John, her voice low but urgent. You see what they're doing? John looked at her, tired but clear-eyed. I see. Sarah clenched her hands. Were you silent because of ethics, or because you were afraid of giving the wrong order? The question was thrown like a final test. John did not answer right away. He looked down at the floor, then back up, his voice quieter. Both. The answer made Sarah freeze. She waited for a justification, but none came. That bare honesty unsettled her more than any defense could have. Back in the meeting room, the debate began to split clearly into sides. One group wanted to end all the trouble as fast as possible. Get rid of Rex. Get that old man out of here. Done, one person said firmly. Public opinion needs calm, another added. On the opposite side, a few other officers pushed back, not loudly but with resolve. Today we almost fired by mistake because everyone was waiting for the dog to go in. If Rex had gone today, who's to say he wouldn't bite the wrong person tomorrow? The statements came out fragmented, not forming a neat argument, but they carried real fear. Tom stood between those currents, not fully belonging to either side. He remembered the moment the gun barrel swept across the crowd, remembered the shout, "Don't shoot." He also remembered Rex's eyes when the dog turned back toward John. He did not say it out loud, but inside, he knew something had slipped out of alignment with the manual he had trusted. That misalignment made him uneasy, and he hated that feeling. Sarah returned to the meeting room, sat down, and looked at each face. She saw clearly that what was happening was no longer a debate about right or wrong, but a search for a sacrifice to smother the fire. She was part of that system long enough to understand how it worked, and this time, the sacrifice had a name, a face, and a story ugly enough to sell to the public. John, Rex, a pair that was convenient enough. The meeting ended not with a clear decision, but with a sense of suspension. People dispersed, carrying their own frustrations with them. Sarah stayed behind last, gathering papers, trying to keep her expression neutral as she stepped into the hallway. She knew that from now on, every choice she made would be remembered, not in files, but in the minds of those who decided her future. The meeting room door swung open just as she stood up. Marcus Kane walked in, unhurried, unannounced. He carried a thin stack of papers and placed it flat on the table with a decisive motion. A solution. His voice was even, without emotion. Sarah looked at the papers, then up at Kane's face. She knew this moment had been prepared in advance. No one else entered with him. The door closed behind Kane, the lock clicking softly, just enough to make the room feel sealed. The meeting room was almost empty when Kane placed the stack of papers on the table. No introductions, no preamble. His movement was familiar enough for everyone to understand this was not a proposal but the next step of a process whose debate phase had already concluded. The ceiling lights reflected off the white paper, making the bold printed lines stand out more clearly than necessary. Kane slid the document toward Sarah, just far enough for it to touch the edge of her old case file. One signature, and you end this circus. His voice was even, without sarcasm, as if offering a humane option. Sarah looked down at the page. The words struck her directly. Expedited removal, K9 unit. A compact, cold term, designed to evoke nothing beyond necessity. Her eye twitched slightly, not from surprise, but from how smoothly everything had been packaged. She looked up at Kane. You call this a solution? The question echoed in the empty room, with no witnesses other than walls that had heard too many similar decisions. Kane leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Do you want more blood, or do you want quiet? He neither raised nor lowered his voice. The question was framed as an obvious comparison, forcing the other person to choose between two harms, one of which had already been labeled acceptable. Sarah felt heat rise at the back of her neck, but she kept her voice from breaking. Rex isn't broken, he just won't do something wrong. Kane tilted his head, his expression unchanged. I fear precedent more than I fear error. The reply landed exactly where it had been calculated to land, leaving no gap for argument. Sarah gripped the edge of the table, feeling the cold surface beneath her fingertips. She looked at the paper once more, then around the room. No one spoke. The superior at the head of the table avoided her gaze, as if busy thinking about the weekend schedule. Someone else pretended to adjust a folder. That silence was not accidental. It was the product of many meetings before this, many lessons about when to speak and when to look away. She stood and stepped into the hallway, pulled out her phone. The first name in her contacts appeared familiar, someone who had once promised to stand by her if anything happened. The line was busy. Sarah tried again. Still busy. She called a second person, a longtime advisor. The phone rang twice and then cut off. A message appeared almost immediately. Don't pull me into this. The words on the screen were painfully clear. Sarah shut off the phone and slipped it into her pocket, the feeling like watching a familiar door lock from the inside. When she returned to the meeting room, Kane was still there, patient. He did not ask whom she had called. He knew the answer before the question was ever asked. Her superior cleared his throat lightly, repeating in a procedural tone, "This weekend is a major operation. We don't have time for emotions." Sarah looked at him, wanting to say this was not emotion, but consequence. But she stopped. She knew those words would slide off this room the way water slides off glass. She sat down and pulled the paper closer. The pen lay ready at the corner of the table, its body cold, heavier than she expected. Sarah picked it up, her fingertips whitening. In her mind, the image of Rex standing still in the square came sharply into focus, the dog's eyes not on the crowd but on a man already labeled a risk. She thought of John, of his answer, both, in the hallway, of how silence could become a charge when placed in the wrong context. Kane watched her closely, without urging. He understood the pressure of time. Every second that passed without the signature was a second the system had not yet sealed the story. Sarah took a deep breath, placed the pen tip on the paper, and stopped. She lifted the pen, set it back in the tray, her voice slow but clear. I won't sign. The words were not loud, but enough to make the room sag slightly. The superior looked up, his eyes opening a fraction wider. Someone else let out a breath, audible. Kane showed no surprise. He smiled coldly, gathered the paper, and stacked it neatly. Then you sign for yourself. He stood, taking the papers with him like a conclusion already written. Sarah watched him go, realizing that from this moment on, everything had shifted. There was no shouting, no argument, only a new line drawn, straight and cold. She left the meeting room afterward, walking down the long hallway where lights reflected off the polished floor. People she knew avoided her gaze, not out of hostility, but out of fear of being pulled into this new orbit. Sarah stopped at the glass overlooking the K9 area. Rex stood in a temporary enclosure, the nameplate already removed, only a faint glue mark left behind. The dog lifted his head when he saw a shadow, ears pricking, then lowered them when he realized it was not John. The sight tightened Sarah's chest in a way she could not name. She turned away and walked faster, as if to keep herself from hesitating again. At the end of the hall, she ran into Tom. He looked at her, about to say something, then stopped. Finally, he asked, "Are you okay?" Sarah nodded. "I'm still here." The answer was just enough to end the exchange. Tom watched her go, something in his eyes mixing respect and fear. In another corner of the station, John sat waiting, unaware of the paper that had just been slid across the table. He only sensed the change in the air, quicker footsteps, sharper glances. When Sarah passed by, they met eyes for a beat. She said nothing. He did not ask. Some questions, once asked, make everything heavier than it needs to be. Kane stepped out into the parking lot, his aide following. Before getting into the car, he turned back to look at the station building one more time, as if checking that everything was in its proper place. He knew that from tomorrow, the story would be told differently, cleaner, tighter. Rex would become a line in a report. Sarah would become a personnel issue. John would become a fading image on a screen, enough for the public to vent and then forget. In her small office, Sarah sat down and opened her computer. A new email had already arrived. No subject line, no greeting, just a short note about a review of her position. She read it, closed it, and showed no reaction. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a few seconds. She understood she had just crossed a point of no return, where one signature could make everything clean, and refusing to sign would leave a stain no one wanted to touch. Outside, the city lights came on as usual. New headlines began replacing the old ones, but the seed of the story had already been planted. Sarah stood, turned off the light, and left the office. When the door closed behind her, the lock clicked softly, like a temporary period marking a choice the system would remember in its own way. The email arrived early in the morning, just as Sarah set her coffee cup down on the desk. No subject line, no greeting. A short block of text sat in the middle of the white screen. Temporary reassignment, effective immediately. No sender's name, only a system code at the end. Sarah read it twice, not to make sure she understood, but to memorize the feeling. She closed the email, did not reply, and did not forward it. Her hand rested on the keyboard for a few seconds longer, then moved away as if nothing had happened. The station corridors were busier than usual. People moved quickly, shoes striking the floor in tight rhythms, radio chatter overlapping. Sarah stepped into that current and noticed familiar eyes beginning to slide away from her. A colleague who used to eat lunch with her turned to study the notice board as she passed. Another cut off a conversation mid-sentence, voice dropping. No one said anything outright, but the space around her stretched noticeably. Sarah stood among people and felt pushed out of humanity, not because they hated her, but because they feared what she represented. She kept walking, back straight, breathing steady, as if this were just another drill. The K9 area sat apart from administration, clean and cold by its own standards. The smell of disinfectant overwhelmed everything else. Sarah stopped in front of Rex's enclosure. The nameplate that had once been fixed to the door was gone. All that remained was a faint smear of adhesive, uneven, like a mark hastily erased. Rex stood inside, large but still, ears lifting at the sound of footsteps. He looked at Sarah, alert at first, then softer when he recognized someone familiar, though not entirely. Sarah swallowed hard. The removal had happened faster than she expected. The system always worked efficiently when it needed to erase a precedent. A handler nearby lowered his voice, as if afraid the walls might hear. "He knows." Sarah turned. "Knows what?" The man glanced at Rex, then down at the floor. "Dogs know when they're about to be pulled." The words were spoken lightly, but they hung in the air with weight. Sarah did not answer. She stood there a moment longer, then turned away. She knew she no longer had the right to stay. John was allowed into the K9 area under a temporary decision, labeled a final test. He stood behind the bars, did not touch the metal, as if setting a boundary for himself. Rex moved closer and pressed his forehead to the cold steel, breathing heavy and slow, like holding back a howl in his chest. John looked at the dog, his gaze darkening in a way that was uniquely his. He spoke very softly, just enough for Rex to hear. "I dragged you back into this." There was no rounded apology in his voice, only a heavy admission. Rex did not respond, only stood there, body lightly tense, as if waiting for an old command he had never forgotten. John looked around the K9 area and noticed the subtle changes, eyes that turned away, footsteps that slowed when he passed. He was used to being treated as surplus out there, but here it felt different. Here, he had once belonged to a system, had been part of a chain of decisions. Now he was being stripped away, layer by layer, without formal notice. Silence did the rest of the work. Tom appeared at the entrance to the K9 area, his stride slower than usual. He stood beside John and did not look directly at him at first. After a moment, he spoke, his voice frayed. "If someone dies in the final operation, they'll hang you for it." John nodded very slightly, did not argue. He replied, "I know." Tom turned to him. "Then why are you still standing here?" John looked at Rex and said, "Because I've been standing here since before everything broke." Tom said, nothing more. He understood the answer was not meant for him. Sarah returned to the small office assigned to her temporarily, farther from the center, its window overlooking the parking lot. The desk was bare, no personal photos, no familiar files. She set her bag down, opened a drawer, and found a printed notice outlining her revised scope of authority. Many lines had been crossed out. She read it, committed it to memory, then folded it carefully. This was how the system reminded her that she was still inside, but in a different place, lower, quieter. News about Rex was passed along gently, almost invisibly. A single line in an internal report, K9 unit under review. No mention of pending removal, no mention of the name being stripped. The public saw only old footage, replayed at the right moments, from the right angles. John appeared in a few frames, blurred and inconvenient. New comments surfaced, less explosive but persistent. "Why is that old guy still around the dog? They're waiting for something bigger." Sarah stood in front of the screen, read the lines, then shut it off. A cold hollow spread through her chest. Not regret, but the clear understanding that everything was sliding toward an ending already arranged. She thought of Kane, of the way he called this cleaning up. She thought of the signature she had not given, and the cost taking shape more clearly by the hour. In the afternoon, the assembly alert rang through the station. The familiar sound, clean and final. People stopped what they were doing and looked up. Orders for the weekend operation were broadcast over the internal system, each detail brief, each time marker clearly spoken. No one asked unnecessary questions. Rex's ears snapped up the moment the sound reached him, his posture shifting, as if instinct had been called by name. John stood by the bars and recognized that reaction instantly. He knew this dog was still ready to work, still wanted to work, even though the nameplate had been removed. Tom looked at Rex, then at John. He opened his mouth as if to say something more, then stopped. The alert ended. People dispersed, carrying unspoken tension with them. Rex remained standing, ears still raised, eyes fixed on the doorway where the sound had come from. John placed his hand on the bars, this time not touching Rex, just holding it there, like holding a promise that could not be spoken. He knew that from this moment on, everything would accelerate. No room left for testing, no room left for hesitation. Farther down the corridor, Sarah leaned against the wall, listening to the echo of the alert. She closed her eyes for a second, then opened them and walked straight toward the command area. She did not know how much authority she still held, but she knew she had not disappeared. Not yet. The alert faded, leaving a brief pocket of silence, like a breath drawn in before the plunge. The square was sealed off earlier than planned. People poured in not because of an event, but because of rumors. Rumors always run faster than loudspeakers. Metal barricades were erected in multiple layers, hard and cold, dividing the space into clearly controlled zones. Television cameras lined the outer edge, tripods aimed straight at the front line, where any deviation could be magnified into a disaster. The pressure did not need to be spoken. It hung in the air, choking every small movement. Radios crackled on all at once. The command voice cut through, short and sharp like a blade. No hesitation, no margin of error. Cameras are rolling. No one asked for clarification. The order was swallowed with breath, spreading through each person like a survival reflex. This was no longer a routine operation. This was an ending someone had decided on in advance. Rex was brought to the front line. The leash was tighter than usual. The nameplate was gone, but the body and the eyes were still familiar. Tom stood beside him, his hand trembling very slightly despite his effort to stay calm. He leaned down and spoke quickly, voice low. "Listen to me, please." The words came out before he had time to consider whether they were appropriate. Rex tugged lightly on the leash, ears straight up, eyes sweeping the crowd, then stopping at the edge of the scene, where John was being held behind a secondary barrier. The recognition was quick, but enough to dry Tom's throat. John stood in a tightly controlled position, 2 officers flanking him. He was not allowed to step forward, and was not allowed to leave. He knew he was here because they needed a final variable, an element to assign blame if everything slipped off script. He looked at Rex and recognized the familiar tension in the dog's stance. Not fear, but waiting. Waiting for a signal that today might never be allowed to be given. In the command center, Sarah stood behind the wall of screens, but her position had been pushed back. She no longer had authority to issue orders, only to observe. Someone else stood at the controls, reading numbers, calling positions. Sarah clenched her teeth when she realized every camera angle had been adjusted to frame Rex. Not the crowd, not the shield line, the dog. She murmured, low enough for only herself to hear. They want him to fail. Kane appeared behind the command barrier, posture straight, hands clasped behind his back. He spoke to the superior beside him, voice even. Today it ends. No need to explain what was ending. The sentence carried a cold certainty, as if every branch had already been cut away. The crowd at the front began to surge when a smoke blast popped at the edge of the square. Not loud, but sudden enough to shatter the fragile order. People screamed, some fell, and cries broke out amid police shouts. Hold the line. Shields were raised higher. Barricades rattled under pressure from behind. Cameras zoomed in tight, catching panicked faces, raised arms, phones filming wildly. In the middle of the chaos, a subject burst through a secondary barrier. He ran unevenly, shoulders slamming into metal, one arm clutched tight to his chest, eyes red like someone driven into a corner. Someone screamed, voice cracking, "Bomb!" The word spread instantly, like fire hitting wind. Bomb, a keyword, powerful enough to shorten every procedure to a dangerous minimum. The front line froze for a fraction of a second, then instinct took over. The command attack burst out almost simultaneously from 2 different radios. No one waited for confirmation. No one looked back. The sound tore through the air. Familiar, decisive, exactly as Kane wanted. Rex surged half a step, then stopped completely. The stop was not loud. No feral growl. Just a sudden halt, as if a hand had been placed on the dog's chest and held him back. Rex turned his head, eyes searching toward the edge of the scene. John stood there, motionless, his gaze locked on Rex. The distance between them was not far physically, but it was blocked by barricades, by rules, by everything that had accumulated since the beginning of this story. Tom felt the change through the leash. His heart pounded so hard his ears rang. He knew this moment was more dangerous than any charge. He also knew that if Rex did not go, the guns behind him would. He opened his mouth, but no new words came. The commands he had memorized all his life suddenly meant nothing. In the command center, Sarah shot to her feet, but no one looked at her. The main screen zoomed in on Rex turning his head. The angle was perfect, the lighting clear, enough to turn the image into a symbol for a story about to be told. Sarah caught Kane in a side frame, unmoving, simply watching. She understood. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The crowd ahead remained in chaos. The subject ran a few more steps, then slipped and fell after tripping over someone's legs. Metal clanged against the ground, maybe a knife, maybe something else. But the decisive moment had already been stretched to its limit. Rex still stood frozen, body tight as a drawn wire. All eyes converged on him. John clenched his hands. He felt the pulse in his wrists, the same place that had once been familiar with leashes and orders. He knew that one word could redirect everything. He also knew the cost of that word would not end in this square. He looked at Rex and saw not blind waiting in the dog's eyes, but a familiar question, the one that had followed him throughout his military life. "Are you sure?" Tom glanced at John in that brief instant. He wanted to shout, to force everything back into the manual, to end the uncertainty that was grinding his nerves down. But he also saw clearly that if Rex lunged and it was wrong, he would be the one pulling the trigger next. The thought drained the warmth from his hands. Kane tilted his head very slightly, as if evaluating a chessboard at the decisive turn. He did not issue another order. He did not need to. The system had been built to react on its own when a variable refused the script. Gun barrels behind Rex began to lift higher. Firing angles adjusted. An officer whispered into the radio, voice tight, "If he doesn't go, we will." Rex held for one more beat. Then he turned fully toward John. This time, his gaze was no longer lost in the crowd. It fixed, clear, searching for a final anchor. John stood at the edge of the scene, restrained, forbidden to step forward, forbidden to turn away. Everything collapsed into this moment, like a lock with the key already inserted, waiting to be turned. The camera zoomed in on Rex first. The frame was so tight that viewers could clearly see every heaving breath in the dog's chest, every strand of fur trembling slightly from wind and tension. Then the image cut quickly to John. His face filled the screen for a brief moment, but long enough to catch the sweat at his temple vibrating like a string pulled too tight. His eyes did not blink, not because he was calm, but because he was holding himself back from being dragged into the familiar vortex of choices. The crowd at the front kept pushing, cries and screams stacking into a thick layer of noise. Phones were raised high, lenses panned back and forth as if hunting for a decisive moment. Rex remained motionless at the front line, body rigid, eyes fixed on John. The leash in Tom's hand trembled slightly with every small movement of the dog. Tom felt his heart pounding up into his throat. In the command center, Sarah clutched the radio. She knew she no longer had the authority to issue orders, but the instinct of a daughter surged, stronger than any protocol. Her voice burst out, tight and urgent. "Dad, don't let them shoot the wrong person." The words cut through space, reaching the scene like a fragile thread. Sarah heard her own voice shaking, something that had rarely happened throughout her career. She knew she had said what she should not have said, but she could not hold it back anymore. Tom turned his head and looked at John. Sweat ran down his spine, his hand gripping the leash until it went numb. He shouted, his voice cracking under the pressure. "Give the order. Do you want us dead?" The question was not meant to get an answer, but to dump the fear piling up inside him. Tom was no longer speaking to a homeless man, nor to a veteran. He was speaking to someone holding something he himself was afraid to hold. John looked at Tom first. In his eyes, there was no blame, no pride, only the exhausted understanding of someone who had stood in that place for too much of his life. Then he looked at the crowd, the panicked faces, the bodies pressed together. Finally, he looked at Rex. His lips parted slightly, just enough for a word to form, but no sound came out. He closed his mouth. The decision took a single moment, but it carried the weight of an entire lifetime of consequences. Rex shifted forward half a step, just half a step. Then he stopped, as if holding himself down with his own body. That movement sent a ripple of panic through the front line. Several gun barrels behind Rex swung directly toward the suspect. Firing angles adjusted quickly and dangerously. Radios erupted with overlapping commands, inconsistent and rushed. The sense of control visibly dissolved. John stayed silent. He stood straight, both hands clenched white. He knew this silence was forcing the team into another operational option, more dangerous in execution. But he also knew it was the only option that did not force him to put a full stop to a human life while he was still unsure. He had lived his entire life with that question, and he was not about to answer it differently just because there were more cameras. Tom clenched his teeth and signaled with his hands. With no new command from John, the formation had to adapt on its own. Shields were pushed forward, tasers readied, and smoke grenades prepared. One smoke canister was thrown, blooming in the middle of the square and cutting visibility in an instant. The crowd panicked further, people trampling each other to find a way out. Screams tore the air. Metal slammed against metal, and footsteps thundered like a wave. Rex remained still, did not charge into the smoke, did not attack. He held his position like a fixed anchor in the chaos. John saw it, and knew the dog had understood his decision in its own way. No command was needed, only consistency. The suspect was closed in on from multiple directions. He staggered and fell after colliding with someone else. Shields pressed down, tasers fired, electricity snapping sharp and brief. He screamed, then was pinned hard to the ground. In the struggle, a crude improvised device fell from his jacket, exposed wires, a hastily taped battery. A knife slipped from his hand and skidded across the concrete. There was no explosion, no flash, only ragged breathing and screams that slowly died down. No one died, but the price was not small. Several people in the crowd were injured from the crush, and a woman fell and struck her head, blood running down her forehead. An officer slipped in the smoke, his shoulder slamming into a barricade, and had to be pulled out. Ambulance sirens wailed, overlapping with radio chatter and crying. The scene became a tangle of chaos that was hard to hide. In the command center, Sarah stared at the screens, her heart racing. She saw the suspect restrained, saw Rex still standing, saw John motionless at the edge of the scene. She let out a long breath she had not realized she was holding. No one died. But she also saw the images being captured, the angles that would not forgive the disorder that had just unfolded. She knew public opinion would not ask why no one died. It would ask why chaos had been allowed to happen. Kane stood behind the command barrier, his face hardening. He looked at the auxiliary screens, at the spread formation, the smoke, the injured. He understood immediately what had just been recorded. Not a tactical failure, but a moment where the system had been forced into another option by a silence. The lenses had captured something that could destroy him, not through ethics, but through images. He turned away without waiting for the scene to be cleared. His steps were faster than usual, but still steady enough that no one could say he panicked. His aide followed, about to ask something, but Kane raised a hand to stop him. He did not need explanations. He needed to recalculate damage. At the edge of the scene, John remained standing as the formation slowly pulled back. An officer approached, started to say something, then stopped. Tom removed his helmet, breathing hard, and looked at John for a long time. In his eyes were anger, fear, and something close to gratitude that he was not yet ready to admit. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Rex turned his head and looked at John one more time, not seeking a command, but as if to confirm. John gave a very slight nod, almost imperceptible. Rex lowered his ears, exhaled slowly, then turned back to his position, ready to be led away, used again, or removed, depending on the decisions of those standing outside the frame. The cameras kept rolling, but the most important moment had already passed. In the remaining noise, in the smell of smoke and sweat, a quiet truth rose. No one died today because of a silence, and that same silence had just become the greatest threat to those who believed everything must end with a decisive attack. Morning came earlier than usual, not because of the sun, but because the station had been awake all night cleaning up. Hallways were wiped down, barricades stacked away, reports printed in a tone so neutral it bordered on numb. An internal notice lit up the shared screen, concise and cold. Reassignment, effective immediately. Sarah read the line once, then again. No human signature, no explanation. She looked up. No one looked back. People passing by kept their pace steady, as if avoiding eye contact was itself part of the procedure. Sarah packed her personal items in silence, a notebook, a pen, and an access card, whose permissions had already been revoked. She placed them into her bag, zipped it, then stood for a few seconds in the room that had once been the center of fast, heavy decisions. She realized she had become a variable that needed to be removed so the system could return to balance, not because she was wrong, but because she was inconvenient. She left the room and walked down the long corridor, where the sound of footsteps landed evenly, like a programmed heartbeat. On another floor, Marcus Kane sat across from two members of a committee. The conversation was brief, clean, exactly the style he had applied to others for years. The reason was read without detour: image concerns. Kane listened, gave a thin smile. "They'll call me back." He stood, shook hands, and kept his back straight. For him, this was not an ending, only a technical step backward. He had known this system long enough to understand it did not hate him. It simply needed to erase a temporary risk from the frame. The K9 unit was brightly lit. Rex was led out of his enclosure on a taut leash. The corridor was long and clean, the dry tapping of claws on the floor forming a steady rhythm, like a clock without emotion. The nameplate that once hung on the kennel door was gone, leaving only a faint mark. One handler walked in front, another behind. No one spoke. Rex moved forward, head up, ears slightly lowered. He did not resist. He did not search. He walked as if he understood this was the final stretch of a route already laid out. John stood behind a steel barrier in the far yard. He had arrived early. No one called him. No one stopped him. He stood straight, arms hanging loose, eyes empty like a room that had been cleared out. No pleading, no bargaining. He had lived long enough to know those gestures only made things heavier for the person facing him. When Rex appeared at the end of the corridor, the dog's eyes found him first. A very small beat, just enough for both of them to recognize each other in a world trying to cut them out of the story. Sarah stood farther away, in a shadowed corner of the hallway. She wanted to step closer, wanted to say something, wanted at least to put a hand on her father's shoulder. But she stopped. She understood that one step would trigger a lifetime of professional pursuit, not through threats, but through quietly closed doors. She stayed still and let distance do the rest. Rex was pulled past John. The leash tightened. Metal clicked softly. John bowed his head just slightly, like an old habit. He spoke very quietly, his voice not issuing a command, more like a statement given to himself. Stay. The sound fell onto the cold concrete, not loud, but clear enough for Rex to stop. The dog stood still, ears lowered, body no longer taut like it had been while waiting. He stood as if he understood this was not an order to execute, but a period meant to close something. The handler gave the leash a light tug. Let's go. Rex did not resist, only paused for another beat, then moved on. No one stopped, no one looked back. The corridor swallowed the steady sound of claws again. What is right has no place in the procedure, and the procedure does not need to explain that. Sarah watched until Rex's shape disappeared completely. She took a deep breath, keeping her breathing from breaking. She knew that from today on, the name Rex would appear in reports as a closed line, no longer capable of causing dispute. She also knew her own name would appear somewhere else, lower, farther away, enough not to make anyone uncomfortable. John turned his back on the K9 area. He walked out of the station, into a city already lighting up, though the sky was still bright. The nearby train station was as loud as ever. He returned to his familiar corner, where the light worked, where people did not ask too much. He sat down, back against the wall, hands resting on his knees. Someone passed by, glanced at him, then moved on. Life continued, as if nothing had happened. Morning news moved fast and clean. An advisor adjusted in role for image reasons. A staff member was reassigned to fit operational needs. A K9 unit reviewed per procedure. No one lied. They simply did not say everything. Public attention found another story to cling to. Hunger always needed new prey. In a temporary office, Sarah opened her computer and read the notice confirming her new assignment. She closed it without responding. She looked out the window at cars filing into the parking lot. She knew she was still inside the system, but at the edge, where voices grew smaller. She also knew she had kept something many people had lost long ago, the ability to look directly at a choice and accept its cost. Elsewhere in the city, Kane got into a car. His aide asked about the next schedule. Kane answered briefly, "Wait." He looked out the window, a thin smile on his face. He believed in the cycle. He had watched it long enough not to doubt it. Night fell quickly. John sat still, listening to trains arriving, brakes screeching, announcements echoing. He thought about moments that had passed, about silences that had been misunderstood, about orders given too early. He did not comfort himself. He did not seek vindication. He held on to the one thing the system could neither grant nor take away, the right not to give an order when the price might be someone else's life. The city lights reflected on wet pavement. John stood, adjusted his coat, and turned his back on traffic and noise. In the just right darkness, a question hung in the air, needing no immediate answer. If next time luck does not hold, who will be the one forced to give the order? This story is not about a homeless man, a police dog, or a failed operation. It is about the moment a human being is forced to choose between procedure and human life, between following instructions and doing what they believe cannot be taken back if it is wrong. John does not win. Rex is not saved. Sarah does not change the system. But one thing is not erased: the right to stop when you are not certain. In a world that worships speed, efficiency, and commands, John's silence reminds us that not every fast action is right, and not every hesitation is cowardice. A system needs control to function, but when control completely strips away conscience, it will look for a scapegoat instead of an answer. And when that happens, anyone can become the one who is forced to give the order. As 1, 2, in now. The remaining question for each of us is this: if you were in that moment, would you choose to follow procedure, or would you dare to take responsibility for your own silence? If this story made you think, please share it so others can reflect as well. Thank you for reading. We are committed to bringing you stories that are thoughtful and honest. Don't forget to subscribe to follow more meaningful and inspiring stories.